Our gospel reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. You can find this on page 17 of the Blue Pew Bibles, if you'd like to read along. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One of the British television shows that I like to watch, which is becoming one of my favorites, is the British TV show called The Midwife. And it's a show that is set in the East End of London in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. It's a show about young nurse midwives and some other older veteran nurse midwives who live and work together with nuns of an Anglican convent in that part of London. And the convent is also part of a hospital. And the hospital is a place for women to give birth. So you have these young nurse midwives and some older nurse midwives and also a variety of Anglican nuns, all living and working together in the context of this hospital, ministering to the impoverished people of this particular community. You may know some of the wonderful names of the characters: Trixie and Joan and Jenny and Sister Julianne and Sister Monica and others. They're all just delightful, wonderful characters. And of course, the kind of main plot of each show is how one of the midwives sooner or later helps a woman deliver and give birth to a child. But as I've watched all the different episodes of the different seasons so far, I've started to understand that really, in many cases, is just sort of the subplot of the show. What's really going on in each of the episodes is the way that these young nurse midwives and some of the nuns and others are constantly ministering to this whole community and helping them through all the different kinds of problems and conditions of life of that time that just seemed to overwhelm them. For instance, there was an episode where a young mother was going to give birth to a child, but right before she gave birth to her child, her husband was critically injured in a workplace accident due to the poor working conditions of the dock where he worked. And as a result, he was blinded, and as a result of that injury, he refused to look and accept and be a part of the new child's life that was born to this young mother. And so the whole family was on the verge of falling apart, and as a family they were in great need of the community. And so not only did the young midwife help the child to be born, but she had to give of herself and of her time and of all of her energy to help this young family be healed from the husband's injury and healed from the wounds of what happened in the workplace. And it was about her helping the whole community to bring to birth something new in their midst. So many of the episodes deal with those kinds of dynamics. How is life found in the midst of conditions which often threaten to overwhelm life and the people that are struggling just to hold on to it? So you hear the cry of the show, call the midwife, call the midwife. And these young women and the older women and the nuns and others they work with, they are heroically and sacrificially giving of themselves constantly to preserve life in this community and to bring forth life in this community in the most difficult of situations. Can you understand how I could hear that same call in the midst of this Exodus passage which we read this morning? Call the midwife. Because that's really the plot, isn't it, of what's taking place? How will life be preserved? How will life be healed? How will life be nurtured and nourished and even born in the midst of conditions which have become oppressive and unjust and threatening and hateful? You can hear that call the midwife, that refrain beginning to emerge out of this passage which Helen read from the book of Exodus at the very beginning. It's a transition passage in some ways, a transition from the end of the book of Genesis and to the beginning of the book of Exodus. But it's a transition that reminds us of the great change and the great shift that has taken place. Throughout the book of Genesis, it is the promise of God, God's covenant promise first made to Abraham, to make of Abraham a mighty people and to give to Abraham and to his family the promise of land. It's this covenant promise which runs throughout the book of Genesis. And the question is whether or not a variety of things will ever overwhelm or finally threaten or finally undo this promise of God. Can human conflict, human unfaithfulness, natural disaster, foreign powers, can any of these things which the people of God experience, can they finally overwhelm or even nullify this promise of God which runs throughout Genesis? As the book of Genesis comes to a close, we almost find it being celebrated, that God's covenant promise is steadfast and sure, even as the people themselves have had to go to a different land entirely, even as Joseph has to bring his father and all of his brothers down to Egypt, where he is located there and where he has risen to power. Even there, though, at the book of Genesis, the promise of this people flourishing and surviving seems secure. You remember how some of that happened? How Joseph's murderous and jealous brothers sold him into slavery and sent him down to Egypt, and how Joseph there in Egypt had been imprisoned, and how it was by the gift and his ability to dream and interpret dreams that he had risen through the ranks of power in Pharaoh's household. And do you remember how it was that the skill of Joseph's ability to be a good manager had preserved the life not only for the Egyptians but for all the people in the midst of that region, because a famine threatened to survive everyone. But through Joseph's wise planning, there was enough for the people of Egypt to survive and flourish. There was enough even for peoples of other regions to come to Egypt and receive food there, be given what they needed to live. And that was the case even for Joseph and his brothers and his fathers. So as we leave the book of Genesis and begin the book of Exodus, in many ways we're still celebrating this steadfast promise of God that this would be a people which flourishes and survives and embraces God's goodness for them. The verses that we didn't read at the beginning of the book of Exodus, they tell us how the people had grown, how the people had multiplied, how the people had increased in Egypt. And so the blessing of God's goodness and God's abundance carries across from Genesis into the book of Exodus, until we come to that ominous verse which we started with this morning, in chapter 1, verse 8. A new king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Well, of course, there was a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Years had passed, generations have passed. In no way could this current Pharaoh have literally known Joseph. But what the story suggests is something much more significant, something much deeper. Here was a Pharaoh, here was a ruler who had completely forgotten the place and role of Joseph in the life of his own people. Here was a Pharaoh, here was a ruler who had no memory of the significance of Joseph and the Hebrew people and how they had in fact enabled the Egyptians to flourish and survive in the midst of famine. Here was a new ruler, here was a Pharaoh who couldn't remember, who had no memory of the other Pharaoh who had invited Joseph and his brothers and his fathers to come settle in Egypt and were given the land of Goshen, a wonderful place to live and survive. Here now was a new ruler, a new Pharaoh who had forgotten, who had no memory, who did not know Joseph. It signifies a huge shift, a huge change, something dramatic. Because now, once again, the people of God are facing not the assurance of God's goodness and God's blessings upon them, but they're facing again the threat of a power, the threat and fear of a person who in some way is not a part of, has no memory, has no connection to the plan and the purposes of God which have been unfolding across this history. And when we run into a person like this, what seems to arise in great contrast to the assurance of God's promises of abundance for all, what seems to arise is this deep-seated threat and fear of a people who are different, of a people who begin to make the ruler unsure and uncertain about his own security, his own well-being. And so this new Pharaoh, this new ruler, looks at the Hebrew people and says, they're becoming too numerous. They're becoming too strong. There won't be enough for all of us. And so it's now at this shift as a new ruler who arises who did not know Joseph that the institution of slavery is again imposed upon the Hebrew people. The oppression of labor without the means to get things done that needed to be done is again imposed on the back of the people. The hard taskmaster is imposed on the back of the people because now again is a ruler, a king, a Pharaoh who has forgotten, who has no memory, who does not know Joseph, who isn't connected to the promises of God's abundance and goodness for all. What's it like to be caught in a situation like that, where we have no memory, where we have forgotten, where we're no longer connected to our awareness, to our confidence in God's goodness and God's abundance? What becomes of us? What becomes of life around us? What becomes of the people we stand side by side with? Does fear, does hatred, does suspicion begin to make its way forward and become the order of the day, the reality of the day, the way people interact? Into that situation here in this story of Exodus goes out the cry, call the midwife. Call the midwife. It's Pharaoh, though, who calls the midwives, isn't it? It's Pharaoh who calls the midwives with his own plans, and he tells them, put to death any Hebrew boys that are born, but let the girls live. It's Pharaoh that institutes a new policy and a new plan to eventually eliminate the Hebrew people altogether, to push away the threat he feels from their very presence, to enable him to live in the midst of his own forgottenness, his own ability to remember, his own sense of non-connection to God's ways in the lives of these people. He tells the midwives, put them to death, any baby boys that are born to the Hebrew women. Helen read the text, and as she said to the children, the Hebrew midwives fear God. And as a result of their fear of God, perhaps even their fear of God, which is greater than their fear of Pharaoh, they do not do what Pharaoh says, but they let the Hebrew boys live. And I've been wondering whether that simply is a case of the Hebrew midwives fearing God, being afraid more of God than they are afraid of the power of Pharaoh. I begin to think that's not really what is going on here. That's the limitation of our ability to translate this word fear into something different for us, a different way to live. Well, what if what's going on here is that the Hebrew midwives can remember their ability to imagine an alternative way of living in the freedom of God, in the freedom of God's promise of goodness and abundance, which enables them to not do what Pharaoh has ordered and calls them to let the Hebrew boys live. They turn and even play on Pharaoh's fears, and they say to Pharaoh, these women are too strong. They give birth before we can get there. It makes sense to Pharaoh. Oh yeah, that's what I thought about those people in the first place. And so he issues just an edict that all of the Hebrew boys die. Which brings us then into the presence of two more women, two young women, two girls perhaps. The mother of a young Hebrew woman gives birth, and she takes the child that she gives birth to and wraps him up and puts him in a little basket on the river and tells her daughter, the child's brother, to follow down into the reeds and watch. And there in the reeds, she's watching her little brother float along. Another young woman, an Egyptian woman, a daughter of Pharaoh, comes down to the reeds, and there something happens between these two young girls as they stand there at the river. The daughter of Pharaoh looks up and says, it's a boy. It's a Hebrew boy. And it calls forth his sister from the reeds, and she says, do you want me to take the child to a Hebrew mother and have the mother care for him in the time being? And they unhatch this new way of nourishing and nurturing and caring for life, a way that becomes an alternative to the threat of Pharaoh and to the death he wants to have instituted upon these people. Call the midwife. Call the young girls who can imagine, even in the face of a mighty Pharaoh, an alternative way of living and nourishing and nurturing and caring for life that opposes the death of Pharaoh, the death of a king who cannot remember. Carl Becker is a famous American historian, professor of church American history, who taught at Cornell in the 20th century for many, many years. And he wrote that history is what the present chooses to remember from the past. Here in these stories, the people of God have chosen to remember the names of two young Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. It remembers their names, and it remembers their ability to imagine a God who is greater than a Pharaoh. It remembers their ability to to stand up and care for life and nurture life and bring forth life, even in the face of one who commands death. It remembers two young girls. It remembers a little sister who follows her brother in a basket as it floats down the river. And when she sees another young girl, a daughter of Pharaoh, look and see and declare that this is a boy in the water, she steps forward to say, we can do something about this. We can help this child. Let me take it to a Hebrew mother who can nurse and care for it. And it becomes the way of a little boy to grow up and be one who nurtures and brings forth the people of God as they're freed from Egypt. What is it that we lose when we can no longer remember and be connected to our assurance of God's goodness and God's ways in the world? Helen and I were at the beach this past week and enjoyed a few days there over on the West Coast. And we stay in a spot that sits right by a road where people can drive up to and unload and take out all their stuff and go directly onto the beach. And so often what we do is we put some chairs up under some trees, and not only do we watch the water and the things going on down the beach, but we're watching the people come back and forth as they unload and go down to the beach. It's as much fun, I think, sometimes to watch the people coming and going as it is to watch the things happening on the beach. One of the sets of people that came and went as we were there this week was a young mother and a father, and they had with them a child, I bet about 12 or 13 years old, a child who obviously had severe physical handicaps. Maybe they suffered from multiple sclerosis, I'm not sure, but it was a child that had to be transported in one of those full wheelchairs that go from head down to the feet. Obviously, the child could not do anything for themselves, could barely move, couldn't talk, just sort of made noises. And as we sat there and watched, I watched this young couple bring this child up in a wheelchair, come up to the sand and then unbuckle the child and then carry the child 50, 60, 70 yards across the hot sand and put down a blanket and then put the child down on the blanket and care for the child there, and then eventually pick up the child, the two of them, and take the child down into the water and float together and let some of the warm Gulf water go across the child's head and hair, and all I could hear were the noises of the child, the kind of screams. I weren't sure if they were screams of delight or fear or whatever going on, but just watching them for 2-3 days do this. And I found myself thinking each time that I watched them, how are they able to do this? How can they do this? Have they got enough suntan lotion on that child, sunblock, so the child's not getting sunburned? What kind of energy, what kind of capacity does it take to bring this wheelchair up to the beach and even have to lock it up to a wooden post so somebody doesn't steal a wheelchair and then have to struggle carrying this child through the hot sand? Is this a good thing or is it bad? I constantly was questioning and asking myself about all the issues that in my mind I was conjuring up. That would be obstacles, that would be difficulties for caring for a child like this in this way. And I was just overwhelmed with the capacity of these parents and their ability to do this. But I just felt at unease and in a sort of distress, and I couldn't understand why I was so bothered by it. And until finally it came to me and I realized that I wasn't able to imagine the joy and love that these parents must have been experiencing as they cared for this child in this way, as they gave of themselves and worked so hard to make something which just seemed like a normal everyday occurrence to me on vacation happen for someone they loved. I was just bothered by my inability to put myself in their place and understand fully their ability to imagine and embrace and live into a way of life that was caring, that was loving, that was different, that was freed from all of the constraints that I kept building up in my mind about what could and couldn't happen, and what was and was not good, and what was and was not right. And I began to wonder what prison I was putting around myself, as I could no longer remember, could no longer fully trust, could no longer completely believe in the promises of God to provide abundantly and with good and with love and with care for everyone, no matter what circumstance, no matter what condition. What happens when we forget? When we no longer remember? When a king arises who did not know Joseph? When believers begin to live daily, restrained and confined by their own awareness and sense of the world's limitations and impositions and fears and hatred around them, and can no longer imagine the alternative of freedom and of goodness and abundance for all. Jesus had his disciples, and he gathered them, and he said, "Who do people say that I am?" "Oh, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say you might be this person, some." And Jesus said, "No, it's not what other people are saying. Who do you say that I am?" And Peter blurted out, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I would build this church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Really? Peter, of all people, these disciples, these fishermen, they're the ones the church is going to be built upon? They're the ones who will carry out the ministry and embody Christ? Really? You're the ones? Don't forget it. You are. What are you going to do? Amen.